Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. The strange music show that dives into all sorts of different albums simply because we can do so. Because people make things and it's fun to discuss it, I feel. So anyway, in today's episode we're of course returning to Swans, aren't we? The ever-growing playlist in the Weird Music channel where we dive into each and every album by the band, or most of them anyway it seems. So, following on from the last video, where we actually went back into Swans' earlier years when we discussed Real Love, a rather strange release that I actually enjoyed more than most people did, it seems, for some reason. We're now returning to the current era of the band, back to the mid-90s, with a look at a very neat album from their discography, I have to say. Now, weirdly, this was always an album that I never listened to all of that much, truth be told. I have heard it before. The album's beginning half is certainly grand, but it was never really my thing, and thus I don't think I ever stuck with it as much as I had done with other albums by the band. But since writing about it for this very show, and really diving into each and every song, I have to say I've come to discover just how much I really enjoy this one. A ferocious and dark album experience that brings back all of that anger and grit that was kind of missing from the likes of Love of Life. So yes, without further ado, I present the Great Annihilator by Swans. So, of course, during these parts we ask ourselves, who were Swans? In this case, when the Great Annihilator was first released, right? So, we've got lots of familiar names on this one, some new ones here and there as well, and a bunch of people brought in for just a handful of different tracks, actually. So the main lineup sees Michael Gira at the forefront, on vocals, guitars, sound, art design, and production, of course. Followed by Jarbo on vocals, sound, organs, and keyboards. It is then we actually have the late Bill Rieflin in his debut for Swans here, a musician who's worked with so many different bands and artists across his extensive career, including the likes of Nine Inch Nails and R.E.M. actually, performing drums, percussion, sound, and additional sequencing. We then, of course, have the ever-brilliant Algis Kizis on bass guitar, the return of Norman Westberg on guitar here as well as the addition of Clinton Steele on guitar as well. So alongside this sort of core lineup for the group, you do also get Ted Parsons performing drums on 3 of the tracks, one John Sarfel performing piano on the track Warm, and one Nikki Scopoletis performing guitar on the aforementioned track as well. I think as well Larry Seven also pops up on one of the tracks here and there, but I can't remember which one, I do apologise. And I do also want to point out as well that we actually get what I think is technically the first appearance of another one of my top favourite members of Swans, Phil Puleo, who is credited with artwork for the Great Annihilator. I don't think we're going to be discussing his musical contributions to the group until we get to covering Swans Are Dead, I believe it is, but hey, it's cool to see him finally pop up here. So, of course, we are reviewing the Great Annihilator, which is a rather fascinating album within Swans' discography. One with a very loyal fan base behind it, much like you get with White Light from the Mouth of Infinity. And so, yeah, the 9th official studio album released on January 24th, 1995 through Gira's label Young God, acting as well as a companion album to Gira's solo work of Drainland, which I think was recorded a little bit after this one here. Which also, I'm going to mention, is featured as a bonus disc on this physical copy that I own. Both packaged together here, very cool. Very neat, and it's probably an album we should actually dive into at some point, but we will get to that another day. But yes, the Great Annihilator, this is like a ferocious album for the most part. There's actually a lot of melodies in the songs, drawing upon the framework that I think was established as early back as Children of God. Though, like that particular album, there is a lot more grit and punch here. Something that I'm going to say was lacking a bit on a fair few of the Swans albums that we've been looking at previously. But yes, The Great Annihilator, an album that I think just gets better and better each and every time I listen to it, especially in the album's latter half when things really seem to kick off. It's one I've had a lot of fun diving into, and I'm very much looking forward to finally presenting it here on Weird Music, so let's dive into it. So opening up with In, we have a short 2-minute instrumental to set the scene and sort of get the proceedings going. You kind of got this howling screech acting like a percussion almost, with the stab of the guitar backing it all up, and urgency from the drums just setting this ferocious tempo before some vocal hums coming over it. And there's an odd foreboding intensity to the whole thing, and I'm kind of reminded of a lot of the incidental tracks that you saw in the likes of Omniscience, things like Rutting, where we just had this manic drive from the band, just immediately starting everything in high gear. But this one adds in such a ghostly presence throughout it all as it progresses, ending on the creepy sound of a child laughing away, which is weird that it pops up on a fair few Swans songs, right? Goodness though, it's very short and to the point, but I think it's a perfect way to establish the rather dark gothic aesthetic that's been carrying its way along a lot of the previous albums we've been looking at. Something very sinister and menacing about it as we're just thrown headfirst into this swirling miasma. But following all that laughter though, it all goes straight into the next song of I Am the Sun. So yeah, immediately start with just everyone in high gear, just Gira just launching into uttering the aforementioned phrase, accompanied by all the guitars and the bass and the drums and the keyboards and everything, for it all just stops the momentum, lets a brief silence hang in the air before building up that start once again, and going over and over and over. And with each iteration, Gira is just launching into each and every line from the song, creating this very weird staggered pace that is just constantly stopping. But it's only made slightly easier when you actually get this connecting sound of a fuzzy guitar just, wailing like the buzz of a chainsaw, before it then itself is backed up by some lovely backing vocals from Jabo. We're right back into that this frenetically paced dirge that pounds you over the head with each and every smash of the drums, essentially. My goodness, the pacing of this one is really, really weird, and one of the more fascinating things about it. Really adding to the ominous vibe that the whole thing's presenting. But there's something oddly exciting about it all, especially with the way Gira is just crooning away this rather strange imagery, calling back to one of his favourite themes, of course, the sun. The song itself, according to Gira, seeks to regard itself with the kind of disturbing imagery of a deranged person realising they can spread evil throughout the world. This sort of disturbing imagery of this maniac spreading their message throughout the world, likening themselves to the sun itself, and how it just pours its light all over the world, but in this case, something rather dark. Towards the end though, following some repetitions of just the phrase I love everyone, you're kind of getting a quasi-religious imagery that harkens back to the kind of things we got from Children of God, arguably. And it becomes very intense when we're just left with this constant pounding of the drum, just driving force, pushing it further and further into this very sinister darkness. And so I should admit, it's not really a favourite of mine from the album. I do like a fair bit about what this song is doing, and it does, very well pushes right into the core themes following the album's instrumental opening, showcasing that we're getting an album that's going to be very macabre, no doubt. Something about this one just feels like the classic thing that they were doing in the 90s, harkening back to tracks like Amnesia, where the tempo just stops and starts constantly. It's odd, as it feels like a quintessential song, Swans track, especially in regards to the things that they did in this era, but it's something about it is just not really my top favourite thing, I don't know why, but it does work very nicely in presenting the overall themes that the album's going to be going for. And so our next track of She Lives. So this is a very peculiar and sinister track, no doubt. Opening up with a crunchy, delayed low end of guitar, you kind of have this acoustic line coming through, establishing this melody that throws it all up a bit with each and every repetition. And you're getting many loops of this bar, accompanied by an assortment of instruments caught in so many different effects, including the faint little drone in the background. And when Gira sings, we're given another croon of esoteric imagery here, this macabre look at someone maybe being executed perhaps, or maybe just experiences this moment of pure destruction as their body just completely tears apart, offside this assertion that Gira is stating that they're alive. Very weird, sinister imagery, maybe kind of calling back to sort of like serial killer imagery, which pops up a little bit on this album actually as well. But it's another weirdly paced one, another one that kind of has that stop and start tempo prevalent in the previous track that we just had. But there's something that I think is rather cool and dark about it though. Like, this very hypnotic quality the way that Gira is singing this one, just keeping the energy going with this acoustic guitar. And I don't know why, but this has actually always been one of my more favourite tracks from the album itself though. A track that has always stood out to me. And once again really ties into that aesthetic that was established on the likes of both Children of God and White Light from the Mouth of Infinity, to be fair. This dominance from that acoustic guitar, but having everything else accompanying it as well, drones from the keyboards, fuzz from the guitars, and even some brass I think makes its way into this one, but I'm really not too sure about that one, don't quote me on it. Like, I think there's some there, but to be fair, it might just be Jarbo's work as well. But definitely a moody number that feels very foreboding as it all occurs. Before this one does finish off though, you actually do get a brief little change around 5 minutes into this one. Like, the whole song seems to fade out, and you find yourselves in another fervently paced drive, this urgent tempo from the drums, a bass playing a very weird melody as this rush of the guitars pushes it all forward before you get these really ghostly wails coming in and so ethereally around the whole thing. It kind of harkens back to the opening track, I'd say, creating a short instrumental moment that drives the whole thing along. And thematically, I can only seem to interpret this as being the side of the story from the aforementioned woman that was mentioned in all the lyrics, this imagery of a burning effigy, screaming and crying as she's reduced to ash and cinders perhaps. It's hard to know because this section does feel a little bit shoehorned in, I'm gonna say. Like, it's a song that was recorded separately and was then later added on to the main bulk of She Lives, but I don't know for sure, to be fair, I have no idea. But it does do an interesting thing of kind of helping to continue the strange musical palette that the whole album is presenting to us. And because of that, I kind of like it. I think it works nicely for the most part, and it results in another highlight from this album. A strange track that feels sinister and deadly with its rather uncomfortable and ritualistic imagery of sorts. It has one of the strengths of the album, to be fair, actually, of the string of releases from The Burning World to even White Light and Love of Life. Swans were tapping into an arguably more accessible sound, or at least more accessible than what they were doing in the sort of no wave era back in the 80s. And I feel like that's a lot more evident on this album in a lot of respects, But on the Great Annihilator as well, lyrically it's still tapping into what Swans do so well and what Gira does so well with his writing, which is, presenting these really dark, sinister stories that really get under your skin. And it's what makes the music so dark, as well as how it all sounds, accessible but dark. It just makes something very uncomfortable, I have to say. But still, very cool, very cool. So moving along, we then get to Celebrity Lifestyle, which I believe was released as a single for the promotion of the Great Annihilator here. So this one has a very jangly drive, and a fair bit of distortion in the guitars and this constant stabbing motion from the percussion, before Gira just begins this drawl as he goes through all the lyrics, this kind of dark track that looks at the kind of parasitic culture of celebrities. From fans who idolise people they don't know to even the ultra-wealthy just paying for whatever their perverted minds could ever ask for. Something that we are very aware of the existence of now, even though we all suspected it, but let's not really go there. But anyway, it's a very urgent track, isn't it? One that feels very angry and ferocious for the most part, this sense of an intense energy permeating throughout the entire composition. Especially with those guitars, one just chugging away consistently alongside Gira's lyrics, and the other just stabbing away whenever it sees fit. It's without doubt one of the standout tracks from the album, one that just starts off so quickly, giving you no time to really take in your surrounding as it just hammers against that nail, smashing away constantly throughout the duration of the song. It is weird for me, as it's one of those songs that I kind of like, but it's only generally when I'm listening to it as a result of listening to it in context of the whole album itself. Certain tracks are grand, and you can listen to them by themselves, but other ones I think I only seem to enjoy more when I'm listening to the album as a whole, and I think this is one of those cases. Like, I think a bunch of songs off of White Light and Children of God, like, kind of have this vibe as well, where they're very decent songs, but I don't go out of my way to hear them all that much. And it's not because they're bad in any way or form. I just think I personally tend to lean towards the more unconventional stuff for the most part, or at least I assume I do. I'm not too sure. Celebrity Lifestyle is grand, but it is just, to me, just a very nice, dark, macabre song, and there's not much else going for it beyond that, I feel. Though to be fair, I am kind of given a lot of Bret Easton Ellis vibes when it comes to this particular track, in consideration to his novel The Informers, where the lyric kind of captured this nihilistic, self-destructive existence at this socially elite level. A fascinating book, but oh my goodness, so bleak and dark, but then again most of Bret Easton Ellis's novels are, aren't they? But considering Gira's, love of literature as well, maybe he was trying to capture into something a bit more referential to that, or at least coming up with his own opinions based on his own experiences, perhaps. Maybe anyway. Beyond that, not much more for me to really say, so let's move on. So, next track we get Mother, Father. So this is one that opens up with a rather dark and sinister drum beat, alongside this flurry of sound just colliding around in amongst one another, for quite a few moments before you then get this dirty, distorted guitar coming in. It sets off everything so nicely, giving the track this rather dark, angular edge, constantly contrasting against Jarbo's repeated calls of haze that bring it all right back to that familiar Swans territory. And when she begins the verses, there is such a snarl to her voice, this amazing attitude that goes so nicely in amongst those ferocious instrumentals. It's interesting because as a result, it kind of reminds me a lot of the kind of vibes you got from Love of Life, but feeling very much like in continuation with a lot of that album's core concepts and sounds, I would say. Though perhaps with a little bit more grit here, which is something that I mentioned that albums was lacking in particular. But beyond that, not a lot for me to say about this one either. I like what's going on here, and it's one of those songs that doesn't seem to really ingrain itself into my memory all of that much, but whenever I do hear it, I am just completely down for that really sinister, ferocious vibe that is being presented. Like, to be fair, it does go from strength to strength with how Jarbo is just giving such a powerful performance, transforming into her voice into this snarling beast as she just roars away with those lyrics. As a result, it's since listening to it as a result of reviewing this album, it's actually become one of my favourites. Not a lot for me to say about it, but definitely a fantastic track nonetheless that really pushes the album forward nicely. So, following this, we then get to Blood Promise. So this one kind of opens up with a very drony organ, like wandering into the halls of some great cathedral, though I think this might actually be some guitar layers caught within delays and reverbs perhaps. Maybe. I'm not too sure about that one. But as a result of how it all sounds, it does contrast rather nicely with everything we have heard up to this point, creating a rather serene environment for us to recover from all of this ferocity. Soon enough though, it fades into the track itself, a jangly guitar line against this very slow tempo punctuated by the cymbals, all extenuated by the growing drones from those synths. And it sets the scenes for Gira's customary croon, of course, a rather miserable number that feels like this slow-moving procession of sorts. It's interesting though, because it feels like so much of a part of the specific sound that Swans were offering during the 90s. This more tradition, that kind of more traditional song structure is very evident here. That is also still incredibly miserable and dour. And it's a very interesting one that gets you sort of like swinging your head slowly with this very grumpy vibe, and one that I actually can't really fault. Nothing truly amazing, but nothing bad in any way, shape or form, and definitely ties in very nicely to what this album's doing of creating this very sinister environment throughout. What will be interesting though is when we come to review this track again, when we eventually cover Swans Are Dead on the channel. As it seems for the live rendition, Swans actually completely reworks this song into a 10-minute odyssey that completely changes how the entire song sounds. Something Swans do an awful lot in their music, I have to say, isn't it? Especially when it comes to their live shows. Very fascinating, and I'm very much looking forward to seing what it's turned into when we eventually cover it again. Moving along though, we then get Mind, Body, Light, Sound. So this one opens up so oddly, this very odd low end, an almost detuned acoustic for a sudden snap just has the entire band coming in with that ferocity and terror. And the drums push this one along with that militant beat, with this little melody throwing itself in the background of it all before you get Gear's classic bumpy draw. And so a point to note is apparently that the vocals on this track sound different to the original version that was first released apparently. The remaster, which is the one I've got here from 2017, the whole album essentially was kind of like a remix and reworked a little bit. And very evident on this particular song apparently, which features a very, very different mix, pushing the drums forward and giving Gear's vocals a lot more clarity. It's a grand move, I have to say, as it really helps add to the much more focus on these elements that were kind of a bit more washed out on the original version, I would argue. And as a result, it's a very fascinating and brilliant track on this album, sounding so fervent and so full of energy, but still very dark and macabre as so much of this album has been, right? But there's some wonderful little motifs thrown around here and there, like, for myself in consideration to the little guitar line that follows the chorus of each and every song, like, it just sounds so brilliant to me. Full of distortion and adding in this really delightful edge. Gotta say, like, this one I think is really neat and another highlight on this album for me personally. Like, it's another one that I just can't fault, as it immediately throws me into that really dark aesthetic that so much of the music has been presenting thus far. And it's one that once it gets going is so hard not to be swayed by the entire experience. So yeah, definitely truly brilliant and wonderful stuff here. Moving swiftly along though, we then get to My Buried Child. So this is a very interesting one. You've got a kind of peculiar, almost industrial beat pushing this one all along, alongside the clatter of percussion that brings with it this sort of fuzzy electric guitars. And I quite like how this one starts itself off, this weird sort of pulsating energy coming from the music itself, backed up by some truly lovely vocals from Jarbo. It all sort of feels like it's leaned towards that classic Swans aesthetic though, this oddly nervous and apprehensive pace to the music, further pushed into the darkness when you get a spoken word vocal performance from Jarbo. This just dark and mysterious vibe being presented by everything as a result, the music and her presentation of the lyrics here. And there's something about her particular performance that makes it so oddly fascinating though, especially when you get various vocal layers from Jarbo starting to collide in amongst one another, creating this odd ebb and pull effect between the two states that her voice is occupying on this track. Truly fascinating, I have to say, and a very odd one in a lot of respects, but I can't help just be pulled into this macabre vibe that the whole song is presenting. And as well, there is something that just has to be said about Jarbo's dual vocal performances here. Like, it creates something very neat that I think works alongside this whole album experience, certainly continuing to push the menacing nature that so many of the songs are occupying. Truly amazing stuff. So, our next song, Warm. So this one opts for a very different vibe indeed. A very gentle little piano melody. This piano melody is the one that was provided by one... what was his name? John Sarfell, who doesn't seem to have much of an internet history, it seems. But yes, John Sarfell opening everything up with this lovely piano line. It leads the way for some nice droning guitars to then occupy the scene, creating this very oddly pleasant vibe that clashes against the whole album's aesthetic in a rather delightful way, I have to say. It's kind of weird, because you've had so much darkness and menace from the tracks, but then this one just opens it all up in such a nice way that it's hard not to get lost in amongst those gorgeous instrumentals. And as well, its introduction is one that plays on for a rather long time as well. This aesthetic is once again something that reminds me so much of Love of Life, just in the way it's kind of presenting itself. I'm kind of just getting this quaint little dark Disney aesthetic, if that makes sense. These pretty instrumentals harbouring something dark and menacing underneath the surface of it all. But menacing it certainly becomes when we get this growing maelstrom of distorted drones beneath it all, before it suddenly opens up with the drums and a gentle tapping of the cymbals, letting Jarbo do a charming and gorgeous vocalization over the top of it all. It is a weirdly paced song, so odd in many respects, especially in consideration to how dark and ferocious this album has been up to this point. And yet I think it's delightful and a charming little instrumental that guides us to the second half of this album. A small bridge that is still, still capturing that sort of, aesthetic that Swans do in all their music, but also being very delightful and lovely in its own right as well. Like, it's weird, it might be one of the nicest tracks we've had off a Swans album, I have to say. And for myself, I just adore the fact that there's so many droning elements on this one. These guitar layers sounding slightly distorted and just whining away with all that wonderful feedback, pushed along by an oddly militant drum beat towards the end. Definitely one of the weirder tracks we have on this album, but it's one that acts as a bit of a moment of respite, giving us a small chance to collect ourselves before we launch into the next part of the album. And moving along we do when we get to the next track of Alcohol the Seed, which is one of the darker tracks on this album with its incredibly brutal directness. So opening up with this really peculiar lo-fi sound of noise and distortion, a gurgling of uncomfortable noise before the drums suddenly take it all away, starting this regimented stop and start sweep that dominated so many of Swans' tracks on this album, right? But there's something so in your face about this one, and so crushingly bleak in context to when Gira was at the time. This one, given the name, regards itself with alcohol abuse, doesn't it, of course? And one just has to listen to You See Through Me from the companion solo album Drainland, which is even bundled up with this version of Great Annihilator that I've got here, as I've mentioned. That is one of the darkest things I think Gira has ever released. This raw recording of Jarbo pleading to get Gira to get over his alcohol abuse. And here, on the Great Annihilator, under the Swans moniker, you've got this repeated frame of I need alcohol, a paean to his dependency. There is something so raw and visceral about that, making it one of the more intimidating tracks off the album. To actually further discuss it, Gira was actually asked about the song specifically, and he told the interviewer the following. If you're talking about the song Alcohol the Seed, that was a little prayer I wrote to myself in partial delirium during one of those quasi-conscious states of hyper-awareness one gets when they wake up an hour or two after passing out drunk. In fact, the night was the drunkest I recall ever being, and my mind was flashing hot white light, like peaking on LSD. And in a way, despite the degenerate quality of the experience and all the bad and regrettable self-destruction associated with such behaviour, I was soaring in a real pure way, and had a sense of my molecules dissolving in liquid space, and it felt good. So I mapped out the chords on my guitar, then slept for a few days. So yeah, definitely an intense track with a lot of darkness behind it. It's weird because I think it's one of those things that actually went over my head when I first listened to it many years ago. I don't know why, I probably just wasn't paying attention to what Gira was actually saying, even though it's very hard not to pay attention to just, I need alcohol. But to be fair, now with the context from having seen the Swans documentary, Where Does a Body End, having read Sacrifice and Transcendence, of course, knowing about Gira's addiction to alcohol during this current era in the 90s, it makes this particular track have such a nasty and sharper edge to it. Something that is very difficult to swallow when hearing, and thus a really powerful and rather devastating moment in this album. Raw open lyrics against sonically captivating fury of instrumentals. Like, what a standout from the album. Truly amazing. So we then get to the next track of Killing for Company. And so after the turmoil of the previous track, this one opens up with a soft drone twinkling in place as we get this nice little melody occurring at top of it. A rather gentle, serene opener that is made much darker when the guitars do come in, bringing it back, to that sort of, sinister edge, with a swell of a single chord that just gets bigger and bigger like the very waves themselves, punctuated by the smash of the cymbals at the peak of each and every rise, occurring over and over for a few moments, where it transforms into that sort of classic gothic Swans rock melody. The acoustic guitar and slow builds of the bass and the drums for Gira to start singing over the top of it all. And with how slow and moody the whole thing is, you get another decidedly dark track to continue everything along with. And the lyrics themselves are particularly fascinating here, apparently inspired by the murders committed by serial killer David Nilsson, who would lure young men back to his house, strangle them, decorate and dress them up, whilst he essentially had sex with them and watched TV with them. truly disgusting and reprehensible, right? And Gira's rather direct lyrics put us right into the frame of mind of this murderer who literally killed the company. It is without a doubt one of the most disturbing tracks of this whole album, especially with the context behind it all, further fueling the imagery of these rather dark, sinister underbellies that exist in the world around us. But as nasty as it all is, I really like what is happening across the length of this entire track though, especially with the performance from the band, from the slow, sinister instrumentals to the really bleak drawl from Gira in his presentation of those vocals. It results in a vastly fascinating track, even when it switches it all up midway to offer this weird swinging motion back and forth with the instrumentals, adding to the sinister aesthetic as though we're witness to the very evils committed by Nilsson himself, before Gira takes it a step further in the second verse actually, directly addressing us as though we were those very victims ourselves, staring into the eyes of a deranged murderer as they lament over you, it feels. It gets right under my skin, I have to say, especially with how Gira's vocals come right up into your ear with this sort of sense of spoken word performance. And without a doubt, this might be one of the most fascinating tracks off of this whole album in my books. Maybe even one of my favourite out of all of them, because it's so wicked and sinister and so uncomfortable with its foreboding darkness. And as well, it just sounds really good with how they've mixed this one all together and put it all and constructed it all. It's probably because this side of Swans is one of the things that drew me to their music in the first place. This very dark, sinister aesthetic that permeates through so much of their music, even across the vast range of different styles that they've all opted for, from no wave to sort of classic rock to post-rock to experimentalism. Like all of those different styles, they are just easily able to tap into this sort of really sinister styles and sinister stories. And it just makes everything they do in their music so uncomfortable, which makes it such a fascinating thing to experience as a result. I can't really explain why I enjoy it on this weird visceral level. It might just be part of my fascination of how music can make you experience those complex feelings and emotions purely through the use of sound and words. Maybe anyway. But definitely a fascinating track and a brilliant one within Swan's entire repertoire, and definitely probably my favourite off of the entire thing. One of the most uncomfortable ones, but the fact it makes you so uncomfortable, truly amazing. So moving along, we then get to Mother's Milk, a track we have looked at before on the channel, as this opened up the live album Omniscience as its first track. And so here we have its official studio recording. And so for this one, we open up with a very dark low-end drone. And it kind of moistens shifts like the presentation of spectral beings, behind which a guitar attempts to bring the melody in before Jarbo begins some beautiful vocalizations, before the drones falter off, that and leave space for the sparse guitar line and Jarbo's main vocal performance of the lyrics. And there's something very beautiful and ethereal about this one though, very enchanting about the way she's singing with those gorgeous vocals. And it results in a very peculiar song that feels a bit like a bit of respite from the intensity of the previous few tracks, opting for a much softer palette in the form of gentle acoustic guitars and droning soundscape. It is still decidedly dark in its own right, of course, though, but there's something wonderfully beautiful at work here as well, which is just one of those things that Jarbo does so well, actually, and why she's one of my favourite members of the band. The way she's able to extenuate the sort of sinister edges of so many of the music, but do it in a way that's also beautiful as well. It kind of captures the essence of what Gira wanted with Swans in the first place, why it was named after swans, these beautiful creatures that are also very ugly in their own weird way, right? But there's something decidedly wonderful at work here, like spinning around in a graveyard, as ghosts fly up on all around you, it seems, in this whirling miasma. It's fascinating as well, because this version is worlds apart from the live version that we actually had on Omniscience. The live version opted for much more distortion and angular guitars and a rather straight beat, letting Jarbo's vocals take it away with this wonderful stadium rock aesthetic. But here on this studio version, everything's much more minimal. Stripping away many of those layers reveals something so starkly different, much more gothic and ethereal, I would say. Very fascinating and a very interesting inclusion on this very album. So, moving along, we then get to Where Does a Body End? Another fascinating track within Swans' whole entire discography, I have to say. Like, this one opens up with very peculiar vocal effects of reversing Gira's opening verse, accompanied by this gentle guitar melody that's very faint and sort of light amongst the sort of chaos of those vocals, before it suddenly just launches into the song itself. This rather direct presentation of very existential and horrific imagery. The decay of everything around us, punctuated by the final line of what does a body mean, end, feel, begin, etc, etc. As the song goes on, that refrain is changed by the suffix following every where, what, and who, what does a body do, and things like that and stuff. And it's interesting how it's all divided up like that. It creates this constantly shifting and moving experience as a result. It's a song that has a wonderful pace to it, one that never seems to let go once it's got itself going, just constantly launching into each and every verse with no pauses, no respite, unless you count the final vocals on this track of just going na 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 na, essentially. I have to say, I think this has always been one of the most fascinating tracks in Gira, especially from a lyrical standpoint. This existential question of wondering how we as mortal beings fit into our existence, our physical bodies beginning and ending where exactly. And it's very peculiar as it's very direct and quite a sort of blink and you'll miss it type of thing. But I've always counted this one as one of my top favourites from this album though, something that really captures where the band were at in this current era in the 90s in such a perfect way, as well as also being that classic examination of the self by Gira, interpolated with the query of such vivid imagery across each and every verse. Like, definitely a fascinating track here, and without a doubt another one of my top favourites from this album, and one of the reasons why I think it just works so well. Like, a lot of, some of the tracks just stand out so well and nicely, and they work so well in the context of this whole album, I feel. And I think it's where this album's strength truly lies, is listening to the whole thing as a run through from the start to the end. It makes all of these little experiences stand out so wonderfully and nicely, and yeah, truly amazing with this one. So next we then get to Telepathy. Very unusual track, which I actually don't have much of a memory of when it came to writing about it, so we're going to see what's happening. So this one opens up with sort of Gira's hummed vocals, a very unusual bass melody that seems a bit more reminiscent of the early no-wave era, whilst this guitar just jangles over the top of it all, very discordantly and sporadically, before some fuzz and distortion comes in to drag it all along. And when Gira begins singing, it's a very weirdly wicked vocal performance, double-tracked to give it a lot more emphasis and presence, it feels. And especially with the drive of the drum and the bass, this is another track that stands out so nicely across this album, especially with how the vocals present this very dark, sinister story once again. This kind of aesthetic of the world falling apart all around us, and finding someone or even glancing upon them in all of that turmoil and just lamenting over their existence, it feels. It's so wickedly dark in such a delightful way though, and the sound is something that ties in so nicely to what Swans do, whilst being a little bit different in some respects though. It might just be how this one is being presented, from the staggered instrumental to direct half-spoken word from Gira. It just results something that's truly fascinating. As with so many of Swans' songs though, very often you do get a little change here and there. And this one, maybe midway through, the drums start being a bit more militant, playing a straighter beat as the guitars just build and clamber all around it. Like being witness to everything suddenly being torched and set alight, burning all around you in a spectacular glowing gaze. And whilst it's not my favourite section of this track, truth be told, it does add nicely to the overall aesthetic being presented here, as well as allowing the band members to really indulge in some lovely distortion and fuzz towards the sort of tail end of the composition. Just further pushing that cataclysmic destruction of everything around us before falling apart in this spectacular fashion, leaving just these sparse guitar lines. What is truly surprising is the final few seconds though. This horrible squealing or scream from either a person or guitar, just a spectre burning before your very eyes. It ends everything so spectacular, and it makes for another strong contender as album. Although that sort of midsection is not my favourite thing, I like what the song as a whole is doing for the whole presentation of this album. Very cool stuff. So, Moving along, we get to our penultimate track, which in this case is the title track of the Great Annihilator. So opening up with some truly lovely droning textures, like it all suddenly explodes into this massive, almost psychedelic swing as the song just truly starts to begin. And in amongst the weird structure, you have so many weird little effects and motifs just occurring all around you, with Gira performing many layered vocals all over one another. This rather existential musing on reality just ripping itself apart entirely, it seems. It is such a weird song, as you kind of feel as though you're being transported somewhere entirely different for the ending of the album. These weird, almost sort of quasi-Indian vibes, coming through with how some of the instrumentals sound, giving it that psychedelic vibe whilst everyone else is just rejoicing and reaching out and amidst all of the destruction of everything we know. Weird indeed, but there's something brilliant about it as a result, and I'm kind of reminded a little bit of how Children of God ended with its title track as well. This fervent, energetic experience that ended things very nicely in this sort of exalting way of reaching out and up. And here I can't help but just get into how the whole thing sounds though. This wonderful flurry of instrumentals all coming together into this final moment of destruction before becoming a singularity inside the black hole. Like to further speak on it, the track fades out towards the end, opting for a moment of brief silence before suddenly opening back with a reprise of those instrumentals. As though it's like going through the black hole, we succumb to the singularity and now have passed through to the other side of existence itself, this alternative form of reality perhaps. Like, I don't know if it's all intentional or what, but it's just how this song comes across to me when I hear it, this imagery of this black hole dragging everything in and slowly distorting it into something incomprehensible. And especially with how the lyrics are going as well, it's just how the song comes across to me. And it's even with how it's been presented as well, featuring that little pause, that sort of interpretation, it just works for me. And it results in a very wonderful experience on this album, something that is oddly psychedelic towards it's situated on the tail end of the album. A wonderful and odd surprise to hear when it comes to this album. Like, this is a track that I had very little memory of, but something I really, really liked when listening to write about it. So yeah, truly brilliant. However though, you do get one more track. We get the closing track of Out, a direct counterpart to the album's opener of In. And so this one opens up with a rather spacey little beat, and some charming little drones that sound oddly jazzy. The sound palette feels nothing like we've experienced before, though Jarbo's gorgeous vocalizations pull it all into a semblance of reality that makes a little bit more sense. And after everything experienced thus far, it feels like a final moment of respite, the roll of the credits as we just sit and think about the whole experience that we've just undergone. It's a truly gorgeous track though that gently ends everything in such a nice charming way, and whilst it arguably feels like there's a little bit less happening here than everything we've had on the album, I think it's a truly fitting way to end everything. This oddly, arguably jazzy ambient experience that calms everything down so wonderfully. An odd way to end it all, but it works very nicely as well, and out of all of the more incidental tracks we've had on a lot of the Swans albums, this might be a favourite of mine as well, I have to say. But my goodness, what an album. So The Great Annihilator. I think to me this is a bit of an oddity in some respects, but not in a bad way at all. It's an album that is so highly revered by so many fans of the band, regarded as one of their best, and especially towards the end, I think I can see why. To me, this feels like much more of a successor to what was established on White Light from the Mouth of Infinity than what we were given with Love of Life. Whilst I don't dislike Love of Life, it just seems to suffer a little bit from what I would argue as disorganization and lack of clear vision. Whereas here on The Great Annihilator, a lot of those concepts and ideas in terms of how the music is presented, from having your main tracks, the sort of dark, sinister nature, to even some of these incidental moments as well, it comes across a lot more strongly than it has any right doing. But as well, there's just such a wonderful amount of grit and menace to so many of the tracks here, making it a vastly more fascinating experience than some of the previous albums we've looked at. Everything just sounds so nasty and distorted and angular, and yet it still captures sort of oddly gothic rock style that the band seems to be capturing this era, whether they wanted to or not. Now, once again, I don't think it's entirely due to this, but this is the point I do want to make. But this album does feature the return of the one and only Norman Westberg, whose presence somehow seems to assist in the presentation of these much more sinister albums from Swans. Like, it's weird how often this seems to happen, and this is something I was actually able to observe in person, actually, so I'll try to explain it here. Essentially, seeing the live tours for both The Beggar and for Birthing, I was able to see lineups of the band with and without Westberg, essentially. When seeing the show for The Beggar, the tour for The Beggar, it was without a doubt a phenomenal and fascinating experience. But seeing the band performing Birthing live, seeing Westberg on stage with them, and seeing what he does, it just made it even more of a phenomenal experience for me. Like, it was weird because I was just constantly gazing at Westberg for the most part, and at times he wasn't even playing. No, he would just stand there on stage waiting patiently. But his contribution adds so nicely to the sonic experience that the band offers, resulting in something truly phenomenal. And I do wonder if something that maybe happened here. Has the return of Westberg allowed this album to have that necessary level of grit and noise that elevates it to better albums than the ones where Westberg was absent? It's a bit of a reach, I'll admit, but I can't help but consider the coincidence of it. As the Great Annihilator, I think this might be one of the best sounding albums from the early 90s of Swans, essentially. Like, it just sounds so phenomenal, so ferocious, so angry, so distorted, and just so wonderful. However, this album is not without its faults, so funnily enough, at roughly over an hour in length, actually close to about 70 minutes I think, it's not the longest album by Swans by far. But a part of me does feel that this does drag a little bit at times, especially towards the beginning of it when you get some of what I'd say are the weaker albums on the track. Like, I find that every time I listen to this album, I do enjoy it more than I ever had done. But I do find that although I like the opening tracks, the first few of them, they just inspire a little less fascination than what happens on the latter halves of the album. And it's not that there's anything wrong with the first half, but it's just that the rest of the album just elevates to such fascinating levels that I think it overshadows the album's weaker moments in some respects, or makes them seem weaker as a result. Now, of course, this is just my personal opinion of it all. It's just how it all comes across to me. Like, songs like She Lives, I Am the Sun, and even Celebrity Lifestyle, they just seem to pale in comparison to the album's greatest strengths, I feel. And they just don't do all that much for me personally. Like, I enjoy them, but I don't enjoy them as much as other tracks like, tracks like Killing for Company, Telepathy, and then even the title track of The Great Annihilator. When the tracks go for that extra level of grit and dirt, the songs seem to elevate wonderfully as a result. And I think it's just one of my observations about this particular album. Like, just my opinion. But that being said, I think this is definitely a solid album within Swans' wonderful discography. And I feel like out the current era of the 90s era for Swans, I think this might be one of the strongest albums we have now heard since we reviewed White Light from the Mouth of Infinity. Weird because, like, I have always enjoyed this album, but I always have felt that the first half dragged on a little bit too much at times, meaning I never sat down with the whole thing as much as I should have done. Like, I feel like I kind of tuned out after times and went on to do something else. But I'm definitely glad to have finally dug into this whole thing as a result of doing this show, which is one of the reasons why I adore doing this show. Like, it really allows me to find wonder and fascination in Swan songs that I wouldn't think to listen to properly, which is a bad thing probably. But yeah, I'm definitely glad to have done so, because it's been so wonderful, like, actually discovering each and every song here. And this is an album that's been so rewarding as a result of doing it for the show and trying to review every Swans album. Like, I have always enjoyed it so much more with each and every listen, it feels, making it a wonderful album from the band without a doubt, and one that ranks, I think, pretty strongly amongst one of their better ones, perhaps. So yeah, I think with that, we will be coming to the end of our episode of Weird Music there. Finally making more progress with this mini project reviewing of all Swans. Like, certainly an ambitious idea, but we're finally getting into towards the end of what's actually going to be part one of this series. We've got a few more to go before we tackle soundtracks for the blind. Just a couple more. But in any case, glad to have finally gotten around to the Great Annihilator here. Like, another dark, macabre album experience that feels so sinister in places, you know. Going to some very disturbing places across all the tracks as well as also featuring classic Giran existential musings from time to time. Truly fascinating, and an album that's become more of a favourite with each and every listen, as I've said. So yeah, if you've made it this far, then I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. In our next episode, I think we're going to be covering Kill the Child. Now this is an album I don't think I've ever listened to. I have no idea what it's about, except that all of the songs on it have been consolidated into one 50-minute experience, so we'll see what ends up happening there. After that, we're finally going to be reviewing Soundtracks for the Blind, a terrifying album to approach for this series, but it's also one of my top favourite albums from the band, so yeah, I will try my best with it, but it's going to be a little bit daunting at this point actually. But there's going to be, I think there's a lot to talk about, which I think is going to be really neat actually. But yeah, with that, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. I wish you all the best. Take care, and bye bye for now. Bye bye.